All right, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, Crystal, wokeness is a problem and everyone knows it. It's hard to talk to anybody today, and I talk to lots of people in the Democratic Party who doesn't say this, but they don't want to say it out loud. That's according to Democratic strategist James Carville, whose recent interview with Vox made some waves in blue check world. Carville is a creature of his party's establishment. The man just wants to win elections and to keep Democrats in power at nearly all costs. In his interview with Vox, he continued to reject what I've called the progressive or bigot binary formulation that the cultural left, which is now crucially alienated from the economic left, enforces from boardrooms to newsrooms. Here's Carville again. We have to talk about race. We should talk about racial injustice. What I'm saying is we need to do it without using jargony language that's unrecognizable to most people, including most black people, by the way, because it signals that you're trying to talk around them. It's true. We can talk about racial injustice, and sometimes we absolutely must. But in his single-minded focus on electing Democrats, Carville is revealing something true. Cultural leftist jargon alienates and aggravates the working class, and for good reason. Rather than residing comfortably in ivory towers, this new language has been normalized by our mainstream institutions against popular wishes. It's really no small issue. Data guru Harry Enton of CNN, one of the institutions, by the way, that enforces the new standards of cultural leftism, recently analyzed the 2020 American National Election Studies pre-election survey. While Democrats may mock them, the fear of cancel culture and political correctness isn't something that just animates the GOP's base. It's the rare issue that does so without alienating voters in the middle, Enton wrote last month. He later added, respondents were asked whether they thought people needed to change the way they talked to be with the times or whether this movement had gone too far and people were too easily offended. People being too easily offended won by a 53% to 46% margin over people needing to change the way they talked. Keep in mind, Enton added, the voters in the sample claimed they had either voted or would vote for Biden over Donald Trump by a 53 to 42% margin. This just gives you an idea of how much more popular the opposition to cancel culture and political correctness is than the baseline Republican presidential performance. Now, political correctness, which Enton reasonably equates with cancel culture, is unpopular, and our elite class is dramatically out of touch, but it's much worse than Carville's concerns about elections. The cultural left has used identity politics to hijack working class issues and to disempower the working class while enhancing their own power. The bipartisan neoliberal embrace of cultural leftism renders cultural populism increasingly important. In March, referring to the Blue Check Brigade's invocation of identity politics to shield the precious 36-year-old New York Times reporter Taylor Lorenz from reasonable criticism, Glenn Greenwald wrote this on his Substack. This transparent tactic is part and parcel of the increasingly ideological exploitation of identity politics to shield the neoliberal order and its guardians from popular critique. He's correct, and he's tapping into average Americans' contempt for identity politics. If you step out of line, even gently questioning something objectionable coming out of your HR department, or your child's school, or a friend's Facebook feed, your livelihood and your reputation are suddenly at risk. Yes, some Republicans exploit this as red meat, but that's actually not hyperbole. It's absolutely true most Americans have not been canceled at all, let alone over something unfair. That's important perspective when it comes to the scale of the problem. But someone in their community has. That's enough to make them uneasy in some cases and angry in others. And they should be, because it creates an ambient threat. For elites, these concepts and jargon like Latinx are their intellectual playthings used to signal in-group status, disempower critics, while increasing their own power. They deploy identity politics to disempower the working class, the rubes without Oberlin degrees who listen to Joe Rogan and can, the left thinks, be intimidated into silence or submission so they can ignore their interests and bulldoze America with their own. Guess who can't run to Substack or Patreon to get their job or their family's reputation back when their office's or neighborhood's resident thought cop complains? This scheme allows powerful people to protect and grow their control, shielding themselves from criticism and dissent at the cost of people who need that next paycheck, but also happen to need their dignity and their integrity and their good name. Those things should never be in conflict. Crystal, this is probably where I differ most from you and Sagar. I think cultural populism is an interesting concept in the context of the economic left suddenly being very different from the cultural left, from the neoliberal co-optation of identity politics, which, by the way, I'll be the first to tell you, I think there actually are a lot of, there is merit to things like intersectionality. I think it gets completely used wrongfully and overused on the left, but I do think some of these concepts really genuinely have merit. And then you see the neoliberal sort of center co-opting them, and they use them, as Greenwald points out, to shield themselves from criticism. And when you're that parent, you probably haven't been canceled, right? If you're just a parent in Kansas who heard something is going on at school and you want to stand up and say, I don't want my kid learning about this, but you also need your next paycheck, you're going to shut up.
I mean, so here's a couple things. Oh, there's a lot there, and very interesting radar, by the way. So first of all, my issue because I am both an economic leftist and also in most ways a cultural leftist as well. My issue with the way that this jargon is weaponized is, number one, oftentimes it's used by tremendously regressive institutions and individuals in order to sort of like Trojan horse in a really regressive agenda. And the perfect example, I mean, Jamie Dimon kneeling in front of a bank vault to signal his support for Black Lives Matter is the perfect example of that. Amazon putting Black Lives Matter onto the front of their website while they're hiring goons to union bust, firing workers illegally in retaliation, failing, and this is according to a lawsuit filed against them by the Attorney General of New York, failing to even meet the basic legal standards of keeping their employees safe during coronavirus. By the way, their blue-collar workforce disproportionately Black and brown. That's a part of this. So that's one part of this that I have an issue with. The other part, and Carville kind of gets at this in his interview, parts of which I agreed with, parts of which I disagree with. In general, I have all kinds of issues with James Carville. But what he talks about is, look, I actually don't have a problem with the language itself. Intersectionality, using this sort of like new jargony language in and of itself, I don't actually have an issue with. Where my issue comes in is when you expect everyone else to automatically know how to talk about these issues. And if they don't, and they use a term or phrase something in a way that's inartful or vaguely offensive, immediately it's a pile-on. It's not about... There's no desire to like, hey, let's bring this person along. Let's just like talk to them about why we found this offensive or why this might be a better way to phrase it. And here's how we're thinking about it. No, it's instant like judgment. You're evil. You're bad out of the public square. And so that's good for building clout. That's good for signaling your own precious virtue. But in terms of actually building a movement to do anything, it's a disaster because all you're constantly doing, and again, this is part of what Carville got to, all you're constantly doing is telling people that you have contempt for them, telling them that you're not a part of this movement. You don't belong in this movement. I think that's tremendously destructive, and I think it goes wildly against a classic left-wing essential principle of solidarity. Like, now to be a good leftist, you're supposed to be sicking like a corporate HR department on some lowly employee who said the wrong thing. Get out of here. That's ridiculous.
Or celebrating Raytheon, by the way.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's something really important that you just mentioned, which is that the big problem here is that there's this binary, right? That if you step out of line gently, or if you have one heterodox opinion, or if you do something that is slightly against the dogma, it's not just that we can have this conversation and like, listen, you know, that's sort of outdated. It's bad for a lot of people, and it's a binary. You are either fully a progressive or you're bigoted. I think Ibram X. Kendi is someone who, by the way, CBS, which is owned by Viacom, CBS Viacom, and you know, says that necessarily to be anti-racist, you need to be anti-capitalist. He went on CBS Viacom to talk about the Chauvin verdict last week. It says in order to be anti-racist. You have to be anti-capitalist.
Yeah,
Jack Dorsey gives him.
Anyway, go ahead.
No, I think again, it's not an unfair argument. But then you're taking it into like CBS and Viacom are embracing it. Jack Dorsey is giving him millions of dollars.
Here's my issue: is like, okay, if we're gonna cancel people, how come the people getting canceled are never like George W. Bush and his neocon friends who are now resistance heroes who lied us into war?
Because
like, let's talk about
co-optation of this.
Right. Let's talk about like, okay, we want to have a conversation about canceling people. Let's start with them at the top, like war criminals. How about we start with them at the top of the list? Or, you know, you never get in trouble for taking a bunch of money from Raytheon and doing their bidding,
right,
or being a total corporate sellout, or, you know, fighting to get the SALT tax cap removed so that your wealthy constituents can, like, being wrong on those issues is never, you never pay the price for that. And so you end up with this really unbalanced system where only certain things are punished. And so people feel free to have all of their terrible corporate capitalist ideology, in my view, and they use but if they use the right language and are, you know what the right jargon is, then they're Trojan horsed in as like some sort of progressive when it's just not the case.
But I think what's crucial about that is it increases their power, and it is chilling generally on speech in this country. And again, I think the scale is important. I don't think, millions and millions and millions of Americans are being canceled every day. Like, sponsor a canceled American, like it's an ASPCA commercial. I don't think it's that. But I do think it's had a chilling effect. And I do think the people most affected by it are the ones that rely on their paychecks and can't run to Patreon and Substack.
Yeah.
And while that chilling effect is happening, the elites are just actually building their own power by signaling their in-group status, building their clout, as you say, and continuing to push out anybody who criticizes them, like Glenn and Taylor Lorenz, which is always a great example. But anyway, coming up, Will Jawando and Philip Wegman are here. Team Rising will be back when we return.